area, but also some of those training opportunities for, I know that many folks are going through the TOT training, and there's other things coming up as well for us to really enrich our learning surrounding trauma-informed practices. So we'll have a little bit of an intro to that. Stephanie, not to put you on the spot by any means, but we do have some of those intro slides. So if you want to expand on any of the work that your team has been able to do, please feel free to do that. And then again, knowing that we're coming from a very large community that's been able to do this work in different ways, we'd of course love to hear from you all as well about your experience thus far on this journey. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Again, Stephanie, no need to, I put you on the spot.
No, I will. I'll give a little intro.
Okay.
Especially since we have so many people who are, like newly engaging in this process, and this is the stage we're supposed to be at. All right, so right now I see, yes, perfect. Okay. Thank you. All right, so as I just mentioned, BRIEF is stands for Building Resilience in Essex Families. It started a few years ago by our system leaders of agencies that were looking to be more proactive. So it is a much larger part of what we're doing, and this is part of our mission to reduce stigma through empowerment and education. Can you do the next slide? And just real quick, we do the agencies that collaborate do serve our residents across the lifespan. So we do a lot around infant early childhood, caregiver support, do a lot with schools around social emotional learning. A big effort, a lot of the people on this call, around transition aged youth, which is even just transitioning from child to adult mental health services. A lot of them referred to mental health associations. So I'm glad you're here. And then the intention is generations of resilient families and sort of breaking some of the generational challenges that every community has. Can you do the next slide quick? And I just wanted to share, this is just a classic model of what a system of care looks like. It engages all different sectors. The agencies listed here, it's not an entire list of every agency engaged in their system, but it is the ones that have been engaging in what's been almost like a 2-year-long trauma-informed initiative, doing assessments, doing lots of training and leadership. And a lot of those leaders are here. I just want to acknowledge these organizations for making this commitment, which is a journey. The last thing we wanted to do is have like a one and done kind of like, here's trauma-informed care, and go ahead and do it. So there's a lot of support there. None of you are on your own. And the intention is that because our families and adults operate across several of these agencies, right, we're all trying to get our needs met, we interact, even if we get one organization that's like completely trauma informed, there still might go to the next one and experience, a stigmatizing experience or something worse. So that is the intention of doing this as a system, which has also built a lot of trust across agencies and relationships. So it's been a great thing. And CCSI has really been our primary technical assistance and training provider in this. So it's also been an ongoing relationship with them. And then that's just like real quick, the trauma-informed values. So we have much longer training on this. What we're talking about today is more like policy, but just to frame it, like when we talk about trauma responsive care, we use this SAMHSA framework that everything we do is built around. So it's like creating emotional and physical safety, trust and transparency, restoring power, choice, and voice, collaboration, peer support, which a lot of you are peers and working in a peer model, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. And this is where, it's really important that we also frame this work in equity work. So is there another slide, or is that it? Oh, and then we talk a lot about resiliency. And I just try to put this in everything. There's tons of additional information about this, but we do try to frame what we mean by resilience and how trauma-informed care relates. Many of you have seen this resiliency wheel. It's just simply a way to organize like some of the main areas in which resiliency is built, and essentially the protective factors that help us overcome adversity and trauma. And that caring and support is the foundation of this. So in order to be a caring and supportive organization, it is really helpful to be trauma informed. And when we say trauma informed, we don't just mean working with people with trauma and helping recovery, which is really important. And it's a slightly different, like it's a clinical, that's more of a clinical thing. This is more like creating the environment in which people do receive that universally these important aspects. And just a system of care, just really honestly, we can think of it as a system of relationships across agencies in particular. And is there more?
That's perfect.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you so
We're
much,
trying to do a
Stephanie.
better job of like putting things in context for people. So
No, I appreciate that so much. And I really am resonating, Stephanie, you just mentioned the idea of creating the environment, right? Of being able to kind of recognize that. And that's really what's shaping our conversation today as we get into the space of policy, practices, procedures, right? We really want to create an environment where folks feel safe, comfortable, they have that space of trust and belonging. And that really, really does go into all of those practices that Stephanie just went through with us, even just at that kind of a broad lens of what that work can look like. And so this is an opportunity for us to take kind of a deeper dive. So Stephanie, thank you so much for leading that beginning chunk. I just wanted to make sure we had that groundwork for everyone here to make sure that we, of course, can recognize those connections. Okay, so again, I already mentioned that today I'm hoping that we're able to engage and share. Again, please feel free to unmute yourself, use the chat, whatever makes you feel comfortable within this space. We also are going to have some working agreements. And so our working agreements or our group norms really allow us to feel like we can show up in this space or this virtual space and feel brave and safe, but also have some moments of being courageous as well. As we get into different spaces where it might be a newer topic, might be something we're less familiar with, or even if we do have some seasoned experience, it's important for us to recognize how we can show up, how we can utilize our voices in different ways, because again, the more that we're able to share with one another in different spaces or even in same spaces, right, we're able to learn and grow in a little bit of a different way. So our working agreements, I'm just going to read through really quickly for us, and then we'll have an opportunity just to pause and check in and see if there's anything we want to add to our working agreements to, again, make us feel more brave, safe, and courageous here. Okay, so our first one is listen and observe for understanding. Pretty straightforward. Again, I know we're on Zoom. If we need to step away, if we need to take our cameras off, if we need to send an email, be on our phone, whatever that might look like for us, please feel free to take that space, but please just make sure that we're still listening and observing for understanding, but also respecting the space of others within this room, virtual room. Again, thinking about asking clarifying questions. Please ask clarifying questions to me, and please ask clarifying questions to one another. I know I'm here clicking the slides and facilitating today, but I only have my own worldview and my own lived experiences, right? So I want to be able to have your lived experiences also shared. So if there's anything that I can continue to clarify, please feel free to ask those clarifying questions. And then again, ask those of other folks as well. Take space and give space. Again, I'd love to hear from you all. I'd love for you to unmute yourselves and share, but also make sure we're sharing the virtual floor with other folks as well. Okay, maybe giving that pause to see if anyone else wants to respond, if there might be any things coming up in the chat, that type of thing, making sure we're taking space and giving space to other folks as well. Keeping our conversations confidential and only sharing insights. We don't need to share name, date of birth, address, social security number, all of this information, right? We can kind of keep things on that surface level and still have the same impact to the message that we're sharing. Be curious about discomfort as an opportunity for learning. This one's really important for us, again, as we enter spaces that might be new or unfamiliar for us, just based on our own lived experiences. Oftentimes there might be this feeling of discomfort. Maybe that's something we want to outwardly talk about in the group. Maybe there's a conversation about, let's say, implicit bias, and we start thinking about that and recognizing, oh, maybe this thought process was rooted in bias. I need to talk about this. This is the space that we can do that. If not, you can take a little note, write it down. Oh, I felt uncomfortable with this topic today. Maybe I'm going to go talk to a colleague and unpack this a little bit more. Okay, so be curious about that discomfort and ask yourself, what can I learn from this opportunity? Okay, challenge gently and monitor impact. The way I like to frame this is calling folks in rather than calling folks out, right? So there might be opportunities for me to ask some additional questions, maybe something that is said I don't necessarily understand, maybe it makes me feel a little ouch moment, I can take a pause and say, oh, that's a really interesting perspective. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you meant by that comment, right? I can call you in and ask for that opportunity to be curious and expand rather than calling you out and getting defensive, okay? Because again, this is a space where we're able to learn and recognize that we only know what we know, and here's a space that we're able to grow that knowledge a little bit more, okay? Be comfortable with unfinished conversations. 2 hours seems like a really long time on a Thursday morning, but it goes pretty quickly. So hopefully we'll have the opportunity to complete our presentation today, but of course recognize that there's always opportunities to continue to learn. After our session today, we will have some coaching calls as well to continue this conversation. And I always like to say Google's free. If there's anything that's really intriguing to us, we can always take that moment, take a little moment to Google, find some more information to continue our learning, right? Because it doesn't always happen in these spaces. And then of course, the last two are speak from self and be present. Again, pretty straightforward. But these are our working agreements. Is there anything that we want to add to our working agreements that would make us feel more comfortable, more safe, more courageous?
I have a question about recording. I would just say, like, if there are times when you'd like me to pause the recording, I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great point. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I know Stephanie mentioned maybe some folks are still jumping in the call. We will be recording today's session, given that other folks might have conflicts and things like that. But that's a really great point. If there's something that we really want to share that might be personal to us, we can ask for that to not be recorded. And then on our end, also, we can make sure to edit some comments out if that needs to happen as well. Okay.
Actually, it'll be really hard to edit them. That's what I wanted to note. Like, we'll be editing in the moment.
Sure. Yeah.
So it'll actually be maybe, yeah. So let's all be mindful of that,
okay.
I guess, and don't be shy. And we'll try to even note if maybe it does seem like a good time, but I'll probably need a prompt. Maybe from you, Marie.
That's a good reminder. Thank you. Yeah. Anything else that we want to add to our working agreements? I saw some shaking of heads, and that's okay. Also, just letting everyone know I rock really well with silence. So if I'm staring at the screen for a little bit, I'm just hoping we've got some comments or just letting folks kind of resonate with some things. So it's not me just freezing on screen. I'm just rocking with the silence for a little bit. Okay. All right, so let's jump into our conversation. We're going to start with always framing our conversation with these three opportunities to ask ourselves if we're actively creating different opportunities. And so this is something that I always really like to just kind of start some practices with, because it allows us to take kind of a step back, especially when we start thinking about the ways organizations function, especially as us as employees. So is our organization and ourselves, are we creating opportunities for individuals to understand themselves and each other authentically based on individual identities, right? Even though we might not necessarily bring all parts of us to the workplace, we want to be able to ask those questions about what makes someone feel like they belong in the workspace. Is there something that, are there barriers there that are making folks feel like they can't show up? So this is just a question that we can kind of be thinking in our mind before we go into practices, trainings, meetings, whatever that might look like, okay? And then the last two questions, are we creating opportunities for reflection and change on institutional issues? And then the same question is for structural issues. Okay, so we might be thinking about how policies, practices function, but then we can think about on a systems level, right? Is there something within the system that might also be creating barriers that then affects our policies, our practices, and our procedures? Okay, so just some things that we can start thinking about as we jump into this conversation. So I know this says in the chat, what are you hoping to gain from the conversation today? But you can please feel free to unmute yourself. Is there anything specific that we're looking to gain from our conversation today? This is me rocking with silence, but I see Rick. Thank you. Maybe.
Yeah, good morning. I don't know. I'm always in need of more resources. So hearing what everyone has to offer or something that I wasn't familiar with is always beneficial to me and to bring back to our crew.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Hi, Tracy. Yeah.
Hi. I would say just learning, growth.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. Thank you. Anything else? I'm seeing in the chat. Jessica mentioned, I hope to take away specific things I can build into our existing ethics policy that encompasses trauma-informed care concepts. That's great. Thank you, Jessica. All right. Anything else that we're looking for today? All right, this is our warm up. We're gonna get there. Okay, this is great so far though, and I see something else just came in the chat. Recognizing some tools to use while thinking about policy and procedure to make sure we're hitting the mark. Great, wonderful. So this is great. Came to the right place. We're going to talk about all these things, and then also really recognizing what resources we can take back with us as well to our respective locations. And so the way that we're going to start our conversation is just asking that big question of what do we mean when we're talking about policies, practices, procedures, what does that mean? So when we're talking about policy, we want to recognize that a policy really is ensuring that we're following the rules, we're ensuring compliancy, right? We're promoting this opportunity for consistency and fairness, but also that moves us to the space of promoting best practice and creates a safer environment, right? So if we go back to one of those first slides that Stephanie talked about when we're looking at our concepts between our trauma-informed care practices, right? If we're looking at our wheel, we recognize that safety, trust, and transparency are really emphasized within that space, right? So our policies are leading to those practices that allow us to create safety, trust, and transparency for the folks internal to our organization, but also to the communities that we're serving. Okay, so we recognize if the policy, we have a clear policy, it's including all of those different perspectives, we can start to recognize what happens to the practices overall. But we recognize also if a practice is inconsistent across departments, if there's multiple teams, different levels in an organization, right, it can create these fractures, right? It can be inconsistent. It can cause confusion. It can cause folks to be upset or frustrated because there's no clarity within this policy, or the policy isn't being clearly defined across different levels within the organization. So we recognize that people impacted by the policy need to understand why the policy is in place, right? We need to recognize that they also have an opportunity to collaborate in that policy. Okay, and so when we're going into our organizations and we recognize that there's already policies in place before I even got there, right? How are we ensuring that other folks' voice is heard within that space? So that might take a moment of taking a pause and doing another reflection opportunity about retaking some surveys or gauging what the interest is, engaging what the values are for the specific group as we continue to grow. Okay, so we also want to make sure that when we're developing our policies and our procedures, that the people who are impacted by the policy are listened to. Okay, we want to make sure that their voices are being heard. Okay, if there's a policy in place and we haven't gauged the need of the community, if we haven't gauged the need of the employees, there might be holes, right? There might be holes and gaps, and we might not necessarily be meeting the needs, even though there's a policy in place. Okay, so our policies and practices really allow us to recognize this opportunity for effective productivity. And then we also recognize that it creates a work environment where the culture, right, reflects what we see in the organization. Because oftentimes we have this conflict, right? We have this mission, this vision, and we recognize what our workplace culture is. And that's what it says written down. And then when we're talking to the employees or the individuals receiving services, it might not necessarily align with what that culture says it is, right? So we have to do that additional work and say, well, this is what we say our culture is. How do we actually make that look like what the community needs? Okay, so this is really the foundation of what a policy is, what it's supposed to include, and how we're supposed to have our goals align with what we're doing in practice. Okay, so when we're thinking about this, we want to make sure that we're thinking about this consistently, and then also how do we sustain this over time as well. Okay, so just kind of getting our mind here when we're thinking about policies and practices and what that can look like within an organization. So we have some questions that actually we were able to pull from our work that we did with ACAP. So CCSI had the opportunity to work with ACAP and had the opportunity to do some planning surrounding policies in this equitable and this equity-focused trauma-informed approach. And so these are some of the questions that we were able to ask when we were reviewing folks' policy, okay, specifically. So we were able to ask questions like, will this policy increase access and opportunity for underrepresented communities? Okay, if we're reviewing a policy, right, if we're trying to make a policy equitable and inclusive, this might be a really, really great starting question for us to ask. Okay, so if we're opening up our handbook, our organization's handbook, and we see an attendance policy, we're just making something up here, right? Maybe you have to show up in 5 minutes. If you're 5 minutes late, that's going to be docked. Making things up here, right? asking that question for that. Will this policy increase access and opportunity for underrepresented communities, right? We sometimes have to look at this a little bit abstractly and say, well, what is the need for underrepresented communities? Are there issues with maybe transportation, right? Has there been this conversation with a community member, with an employee that says, oh, transportation is really hard because we only have one car, I have to drop my kid off at school, and this and this and this. Is there this opportunity to review our policy to say, well, 5 minutes might not necessarily make sense for that 5-minute tardiness, right? Do you think we can push it to 10 minutes to be inclusive of other folks who might have different needs regarding transportation, right? And that's just one small example that we can start to think about. So if we look at every single aspect of our policies and procedures, this would be a good question for us to kind of start with, okay? Other questions to think of: will this policy have a positive impact on inclusion and full participation of all people, right? Again, thinking about that impact on inclusion. How do we make folks feel like they're included in this space, right? That's the questions that we want to ask, and we probably can't necessarily assume that, right? So that means I'm actually going to have to go have a conversation with my team and ask those hard questions of, right, what makes you feel like you're included? Do you feel like you understand the policies? Do you feel like you were asked to be included in this conversation when we developed policies and procedures, right? So these are the things that we can start to think about when we're creating policies or reviewing policies that are currently in place. All right. Other questions to think about: will this policy protect against racism, gender inequalities, and discrimination, right? Again, something that we can think about maybe abstractly, and we'll go to this a little bit more when we have some more examples, but maybe thinking about, for this one specifically, will the policy protect against racism, gender inequalities, and discrimination? Maybe we're thinking of a policy about dress, right? This idea of professionalism within the workplace. Are there other biases rooted within that policy that might make others feel like they're being omitted from that narrative, right? Maybe it's how you show up to the workspace. Maybe it's even the way in which the policy is written. Maybe the policy is using gendered language, right? So maybe it's using language like he, she, right? Is there an opportunity to change that to say they or the employee, right? To again, increase that opportunity for folks to feel like they're included and they belong in this space, okay? Any questions or thoughts so far? Just checking the chat. All right, we'll keep rolling. Some other questions for us to think about as we're in this space, right? Are there changes that could be made made to the policy to make it more inclusive and equitable, kind of similar to some things that we already saw within those other examples? And then what is in place to ensure accountability? This is a big one, right? How are we going to ensure folks are accountable, right? What does that measure look like? Okay. How are we monitoring for implementation? Again, maybe it's going back to the tardiness policy, right? How are we measuring that? Is everyone within the organization having the same rules and they're following the same way? Maybe we have that really, really strict rule for frontline staff, but it doesn't look the same for executive leadership, right? How can we make sure that we're being accountable and making sure that we're being transparent, okay? Because those are some things that kind of show up, and we start to recognize that those things kind of become the norm. And then when we have new folks come in, it's not clearly defined, right? The policy says this, but I also see this group of people doing something else, okay? If that's the case, is it written into the policy to have that clearly specified for those different reasons? If not, how can we make that more clear and more transparent, okay? I see in the chat, Jessica mentioned, what is the recommended language for she, he, they? So I'm going to open this up to the group. Do we have any thoughts about that? Recommended language. When we're thinking about
can you clarify that question, Jessica? Do you mean like in an intake form or something that is like an official document, or is your question just sort of more, because I know like you're like one of my public health heroes, so I know that you're thinking about policy and system change all the time, and that your department is actually really knowledgeable about this in particular. So I just want to make sure that we understand your question.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about it in terms of context to the questions of, how we create the policy, what it states, and then who's accountable, how we ensure its implementation and things like that. And I don't think a lot of our policy currently states gender specific language. I think our forms might. So I was thinking about our forms and how we could work on the language in the forms. I could consider the policies also, but I specifically was just looking for, people's ideas on what would be most inclusive to ensure, that we do have that representation of being accepting of all people for who they are, with that language in any of those such written documents like policies or forms.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that, Jessica. And I see also in the chat, someone mentioned that language of they as well. From my experience, I think the they has been effective. But as somebody mentioned, right, that might not necessarily cover all specific identities. Oftentimes even taking another step back and saying the employee, right, for that individual who might be reading that policy, or employees, the team, things like that, to make it a little bit more broad. And then of course, if there is a specific kind of one-on-one instance where you might know this person's specific pronouns, I think that's okay to have that one specific document with that specific language if it's for an individual. Any other thoughts? I think this is a great question, right? Because it's important for us to even think about that, how language, right, reading a document might impact an individual. Other thoughts or experiences surrounding language and gendered language specifically?
I just want to commend like our Essex County Mental Health Services and other organizations that have actually, with the guidance of the Office of Mental Health, changed some of the intake forms and actually made a policy about it, which is one of our good policy examples. So I guess one thing is to look to your agency, and if there's like a state funder of your agency, or another body, they may have already best practices around this that they're asking you to follow, and in some cases they might even be required. I don't know if anyone from Essex County Mental Health wants to say something about that. I know
I could.
yeah, thank you, Dava, and congratulations on policy.
I when we were talking about language, and Jessica, your questions. So one of the things is that we just clearly defined in our policy, which, I still consider this policy to be in working format. And, we're still working on making sure it's really just inclusive of everything we want it to include, but we have reviewed it with our staff as it stands now. So, sort of always a moving target, and wanting to stay with, stay current. And that's always a challenge, but in terms of just how we worded it so far, we just said that all Essex County mental health employees have a responsibility to treat others with dignity and respect at all times, to include honoring their intersectional identities and the use of their preferred names and pronouns of their coworkers and those that we serve. So, that, and I think you could go further too. So we sort of have a DEI policy, and then we at first I kind of wrote them together like a cultural and trauma-informed care policy, and then I felt like I should break them out, but they're so interwoven that it's a little hard to talk about one without talking about the other. But I did end up going with two separate policies at this time. So
Ava, can you just, if you don't mind sharing them, I would love to take a look at them. And I have been thinking about, like I put in the chat, if we can integrate it with our ethics policy, only because right now we have 5 binders of policies, and we need to streamline in some way. And how do we basically get the intent across and put it into practice, which is most important to me. It's nice to have it on paper, but if nobody ever opens it or knows about it, that's a whole different thing. So the culture is really important, and I think that's worked on outside of the policy. But anyway, if I can have an example, I would love to take a greatly written document and, you know, take some of that language and wrap it into what we have going on here.
I would be very happy to do that. And just keeping in mind that I think I'm not 100% confident about mine either. Ours,
That's
you know,
okay. Yeah, we're just gonna, like you said, try to stay current together.
Yes, I will send it. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is great. Thank you. And thank you for the resource sharing, because this is how we get it done, right? Of being able to see multiple perspectives. Douglas, I see that your hand was raised as well.
Yeah, hi, my name is Doug Meyer. I'm with the Mental Health Association. I've been doing this trauma-informed care thing for a while, and at the beginning I was kind of, yeah, we need to recognize people's trauma and not re-traumatize them. But what really got me interested in trauma-informed care is trying to reduce trauma on my staff.
Mm.
I think it goes deeper than that. I think vicarious trauma is a super big issue. We all deal with people day in, day out that have horrible stuff going on in their lives, and it takes a toll on my staff. So I think things like caseload sizes and stuff like that has to be in policies, or we at least have to take that into account. We can't expose people to all this trauma and give them way too many cases and then expect that they're still going to be here in 5 years or 10 years. Or at least expect. I have staff that have been here 40 years. I have a lot of staff that have been here 20 years, and it's taken a toll on them. And that's what trauma-informed care means to me.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Doug, for sharing and bringing such an important experience for many folks to light, and recognizing that that is definitely a place where we can start emphasizing policy, right? Thinking about workload, right? Caseload, right? If that's a policy that's clearly written, we have clear guidelines, right? If that's being, not necessarily paid attention to, why is that? What does that vicarious trauma look like? Going back to safety, trust, transparency, all of those things, right? Thinking about trauma-informed care, we have to make sure it's reflected in our policies. Because again, this kind of goes into that space of we're talking the talk, but not walking the walk, right? Being able to recognize that. And again, thank you for also sharing resources amongst one another. This is the opportunity because, right, many of our policies haven't always had this perspective of equity-focused, trauma-informed approach, meaning that we're going to have to go back to our policies and do some work, but it's going to be a lot better if we have multiple eyes from multiple different communities, multiple experiences, all included within the development and design of these practices, right? And so also just wanting to note the power of language, right? We just had a really important conversation about gendered language, right? That was one space within our policies and practices. We also want to think about the power of language when we're talking about things like the ADA, right? When we use language like disability, right? Does this individual identify as being disabled? Do they identify as being differently abled? Is there a place where we can have that language in here to have that person-centered approach, right? Because again, that could change the way individuals might be reading or experiencing a policy. So the language goes even further than just the space of gendered language, but again, it's going to be probably a little bit different dependent on the space in the organization. Okay, any other thoughts? One more moment of silence. Okay. All right. So as we move forward, we're just going to continue talking about exactly what we're talking about, and we're going to look at a different couple examples. So if we're thinking about code of conduct, we talked about appropriate dress or professional dress. What are some opportunities for us to expand on this and make some of these kind of foundation policies a little bit more inclusive? How could we make this language of appropriate dress or professional dress more expansive to meet the needs of a dynamic community? Any thoughts?
I think you probably have to be specific or, you know, lay out what that actually means, because for some people it might mean different things.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Definitely. What else? Any other thoughts?
I was thinking the same thing. There's so many different personalities, and ways that they dress according to their personality, which to them may be fine, but to a supervisor might not be.
Sure.
So, I mean, I worked in a place where, you could wear jeans on Friday, but the rest of the time you needed to dress, professional. So, and I think depending on the job too, what kind of job you're doing.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you both, right? Even expanding the job that you're doing, right? If let's say you're a nurse and you have to wear scrubs, right? Is that clearly defined? And if you have other folks who might not necessarily have that same role, do we have that also defined for their roles, right? And again, even being able to see that creates this clear transparency to say, oh, why does, so-and-so get to dress like this, but I have to dress like this, right? Here's the policy, and here's where we can have some opportunities for flexibility, right? Here is how our organization defines appropriate dress or professional dress. And even there, that's a really good opportunity for the team to come together and talk about how we define professionalism, right? Because as we get into this, the historical significance surrounding language, of course, right? This idea of professional might only be aligned with a specific dominant culture, right? And also goes back to access as well. So really expanding some of the meanings behind the language that we see across policies, right? Anything else?
I think like regardless of what the policy is, because there certainly are situations where, meeting with clients, like where it isn't, there are expectations. I think just having it clear and transparent is the key, whether or not it's even flexible, if that makes sense, so that people aren't wondering like, is this appropriate? I don't know. Because sometimes people, it is very helpful to be transparent.
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah. Any other thoughts about this? I know we're just looking at one, right?
What I find jarring just about what's written here is it never crossed my mind. Like how many specific elements we wander around assuming that everybody is on the same page. So
yeah, thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you for vulnerably sharing, right? I know that for myself, I'm resonating with that. I've worked in many different spaces, and the policy just was the policy, right? Maybe there's some things that I push back on, maybe there's things that I don't, but it's this idea of the norm, right? That we're supposed to assimilate to this idea and make that assumption that everybody knows what appropriate dress is, right? Not taking into account, right, those cultural things that might be appropriate for one person might not necessarily be a quote unquote appropriate for another person, right? How do we get to that space of having those open conversations and recognize what those expectations are, right? What about comment or policies surrounding paid time off, holidays, vacation, volunteers hours? How can we make some of these more equitable and inclusive? How have you in your spaces also?
I can say a little bit about that. We used to say that you had to get vacation approved 10 days in advance. And we found that it's probably better if someone has an opportunity to take a day in their schedule, it's probably better to let them do that. I know that works better for me. If I schedule a vacation like a month in advance, by the time that day comes, who knows what's going on. If I can grab a day, I want to be able to just grab it on short notice. So that's one policy that we've changed.
Wow. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Doug. Yeah, that's a big one, right? And I think that also goes to that idea that was just shared of, right, maybe this assumption of how folks are supposed to take vacations based on again, what the tradition has always been, but recognizing there might be some flexibility within your space, definitely. What else?
I was just gonna say that
Oh, you just muted.
I'm sorry, and Andrea, that was my fault. You can go ahead and unmute.
Sorry. I was just gonna say that if, your organization has the ability to, not every holiday means the same thing to everybody. So offering like a floating holiday or being flexible about, which holidays people can take. Or I know, for example, my husband's organization allowed folks to vote and they are getting the day after Super Bowl off. So, just like like allowing people to have that choice, I guess. If you can, if it's, if you're able.
Right. That's great. No, that's a new one for me. The day after Super Bowl. And right, I love the opportunity of being able to listen to the community, right? If that's a want and there's that flexibility, why can't it be written? And then maybe reevaluating it the following year if that's still what the need looks like, right? Definitely. Other thoughts, other experiences?
We did something similar where we have our traditional holidays, but there was several of them that were created to be optional holidays because a lot of our staff work directly with kids.
Mhm.
And so by taking that holiday when they're actually available and not in school was kind of a pain.
Mhm.
So they became wellness days. So we can take the holiday or put it towards another time of the year.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah.
I worked in a place where they gave us our birthday off.
Mm.
But I like the idea of a floating holiday, just for whatever.
Yeah. These are great. These are great. And they're so dynamic, right? It's very specific to that community, right? To that organization, to that team, and also being able to, of course, communicate that to the folks you're providing services for, right? On this day, it's a wellness day, right? Meaning we're not going to be in the office, and making sure that we recognize that we really don't have to work on that day, right? Making sure that that's clear and folks are taking their time off when it's time off. Right? Anything else? Thinking about holidays, vacation.
We also used to get a mental health day if we needed to take a mental health day.
Yeah, definitely.
I would say we've gotten more sort of like openly accepting of mental health days as sick days, where before maybe in prior administration, maybe someone would need a mental health day, but they wouldn't necessarily admit that.
Right.
They would just say that they were sick.
Mhm.
And now I think there's more more of a cultural understanding and talking about that and being okay with that. But I don't know that we have that written into policy.
Mhm.
Something to think about.
Yeah, and that's a really powerful point too, thinking about mental health days, because that has been a shift, right? To have spaces where you are more comfortable asking or even telling, right? I'm taking a mental health day. And recognizing that that can be a challenge, and being able to also model that behavior if you have those opportunities to do that. If that's I know that within CCSI, we just had an instance where somebody who was at the director level sent an email out to the team and said, hey, I'm taking a mental health day. And I know for myself, that was really powerful to see that language, to say, oh, the person who is supervising me also is taking a mental health day, and that's okay, right? And, here's the policy that says I can do the same thing, right? So being able to see that model behavior, again, puts these policies into practice, right? All right. Let's move on to bereavement. Policy surrounding bereavement. The passing away of, right? If we're taking time off, how do we make this more inclusive and equitable?
I would say traditionally this has been for biological family, but it doesn't have to be. And certainly, I mean, people have families that are not, biological, and the passing of those folks is just as important as anything else.
Right.
So I think, the language needs to be created to make it more inclusive and open-ended, if you will.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you. Other thoughts?
Something that just occurred to me actually is I have a friend recently who her mother's best friend, like almost like sister, close, had passed away. And so she really kind of struggled in trying to juggling taking care of her mom during this and, doing so like something like that almost would have helped. I
Right.
hadn't thought of it as a bereavement, but I mean, it was basically like an aunt, kind of like Tracy had said, where it's, that chosen family, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. And how powerful and supportive that could be, right? When you're experiencing the loss of a loved one, right? The last thing you want to be thinking of is, well, can I take time off? Do I have all of these things? But if the policy is clear, and again, that's being modeled and it's clearly addressed on onboarding, right? Of we recognize the passing of anybody, near and dear to your heart, whatever that language looks like, right? That can create this space of, I really, really care for you as an individual, as an employee, and we're here to support you, right? Again, going back to that support that we're looking at from our trauma-informed practices. Any other thoughts about bereavement? All right. Thinking about flexible work from home, flex time, compressed schedule. This one is always kind of challenging sometimes, dependent on the roles and the flexibility within an organization, but it is another good space for us to look at, to have that clear, transparent language within policies, especially as we're in this, I don't know, limbo of being kind of remote, in person, hybrid kind of work, right? What are our thoughts surrounding that? And I see in the chat a question that I think is great. Is there a typical amount of time for bereavement? What are folks' experience surrounding this?
Well, I know like we're at the county, so there's very specific amounts of bereavement time that is in addition to other forms of leave time for specific family members. So if it's a member of your nuclear family or your parent or your child or your grandparent or your aunt or uncle, there's, 1 or 2 days depending. And then, so I think that is where sometimes our personnel departments are not within our exact reach. But then I would think that in the interdepartmental level, there would just be, understanding of use of other forms of leave time as needed for different situations or in addition to the amount of time that's allowed.
Thank you for sharing. And I think that's kind of my experience as well, is again, every space probably has some different rules and timelines about that, but it is important also to clearly communicate that, right? Of within that policy, here are the days, for, let's say, the nuclear family that you're allotted. And if it extends the time, here is what would happen, right? Making sure that's really clear. So it's not just it's only me and this person conversation, right? Because if it happens to anybody else, it's important for everyone else to have those opportunities to be with their loved ones during this time. And so thinking about bereavement, I think it's a great question, because I know that we didn't necessarily answer you in full, but I think that would be another good opportunity as we're sharing resources amongst folks to recognize that, hey, this space has 3 days, right? Has that been effective for your team, right? We offer 5. Is that been effective? What does that look like across teams and across departments? And right, as that happens, we probably need to look at the other functions and operations of the team, as if this person's out, how does it impact other functions of our workplace? Okay. And then thinking about upward mobility and promotion. This is a big one, right? Promotion is a huge space, especially when we're thinking about promotion from within. There was actually a study done in 2020, I think it was in 2020 or 2021, and they recognized that candidates stay longer. About 41% of candidates stay longer with companies with higher internal upward mobility, right? So if we have those opportunities to grow from within, we want to make sure that we're encouraging that and creating a clear policy for what that looks like, right? And again, thinking about that at different levels of an organization. If maybe we have our frontline staff what does that upward mobility look like, and what are those opportunities? And then again, how are we offering those opportunities for folks at other levels within the organization? Okay, that's a really, really great opportunity for us to have clear and transparent guidelines for promotion, but also allows folks to know that there's opportunities to grow within this organization. We're going to invest in you and cultivate these opportunities for professional development, for learning opportunities, for mentoring, for shadowing, whatever that looks like. Okay. When we're thinking about promotion specifically, opportunities to review that are to perform an internal audit, right? Review current roles, any gaps, what succession planning would look like. If folks were to move internal to the organization, we want to clearly define those career paths. So it's great to have the policy. There might be this opportunity to add an addition to say, you know, here, click this link for what that career path would look like for individuals within our team. We want to make sure we're defining the eligibility criteria for that as well. Oftentimes, when we're thinking about promotion in some spaces, there's these ideas of favoritism that go around who's being promoted, why, how often, etc. So if we have a clear criteria for each space within the organization and we have a policy that backs that up, we have these opportunities to, of course, grow our own and grow our team of dedicated employees, but we also have this opportunity for folks coming onto our team to recognize that we're thinking about that in detail as well. Okay, and then of course we want to reevaluate the employee handbook and then have training surrounding these updates of policies. Okay, Stephanie, I saw that you unmuted yourself. I wasn't sure if you had a comment to add.
I'm distracted by what appears to be like an error message. Is that on your screen?
Sure was. Thank you.
Okay,
Stephanie.
I kept thinking it was mine. I was like, I didn't want this thing to shut down by accident. Okay, cool.
No, thank you. I appreciate you noticing that. Any other thoughts about promotion and or upward mobility?
A lot of this is resonating, but this is brilliant. We don't do a good job in this area. And it's interesting, like just to this moment, I'm like, this is a place we really need to prioritize, because I think people don't know and are really diligent staff people wind up in positions where they're just overdoing it because they're guessing. They're probably guessing, their secure place within the agency. So it would be worth really for us to reflect the journey of upward mobility that not only is clear, but then it could also help our really responsible employees relax a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for sharing it. And there's also opportunities for lateral mobility as well, which can also be really rewarding, right? The way that we communicate that in the essence of, hey, I know you've been in this position. Do you want to try something new? Maybe there's not that mobility going upward for financial gain, but there's new opportunities for you to maybe then move into a space where you have those opportunities for upward mobility. Jessica, I saw that you had unmuted yourself.
Oh, thanks, Marie. And I just wanted to, say one of the terms that you've used quite a bit, and I agree with, is transparency. And in regards to the flexible work schedule and the promotion or upward mobility or mobility across within the departments or agencies, I think that one of the things we've been fortunate to learn through so much turnover at the health department is that importance of transparency and telling people what the work environment is and the expectations are, both in what is possible and maybe what we have trouble making possible, even though we would love to make it possible to them. But to have that transparency as people are onboarding to say, this is the work environment, this is the work schedule, this is the flexibility we can provide you. Unfortunately, we can't provide this, but focusing on what we can do and also making sure that they really clearly understand what they're signing on for, and that we provide them the opportunity to ask any questions about, anything in regards to that for our specific workforce, so that they feel like they're not getting blindsided with anything once they agree to work with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comment, Jessica. And we're going to actually have the opportunity to talk about really hiring and onboarding a little bit later in our session as well, because that is such an important opportunity for us to really be as transparent as possible and recognize, right, what are the things that we're working on, what are the things that have been barriers, and also what can you expect going forward, right? So if we're able to model those behaviors initially, we already are creating this trust and transparency, and we're able to continue that across the employee life cycle as well. So thank you for that. And also thank you for sharing some personal experiences, right, about, you know, these opportunities of promotion, flexible work hours, and how you've been able to communicate that within your respective space. Any other thoughts before we continue to move on? All right, so we're going to take a quick shift as we just kind of recognize and pause the importance of also just taking a moment to resonate on our own personal experiences and how those personal experiences oftentimes influence the relationships we have, but also the decisions that we make. So when we're thinking about policies and procedures, we also want to take a couple steps back and recognize humans are the ones who wrote these policies and procedures, right? We're the ones who perpetuate the systems that we're currently functioning in, whether that's for positive, negative, or somewhere in between. We want to recognize how this is shaping our experience, and then of course shaping the folks that we are interacting with. Okay, so recognizing our cultural experiences, recognizing our worldviews and our mental models. And when we're thinking about this, just really, really quickly, our worldview is something, the way that I like to explain it is like a pair of glasses that you put on every single day, or even sometimes when you're sleeping, right? This is how I dream. This is how I see the world around me. I have these glasses on. It's based on my lived experience. And no matter what, I might try to switch glasses with somebody else. We're going to have a different prescription. So I'm going to have to ask the person in front of me, do you mind clarifying what you're seeing, what you're experiencing? This is how I'm seeing it, how I'm experiencing it. Do you mind giving me some clarity on how you're also experiencing it? Okay, that's an important aspect in the ways in which we look to continue to create these effective and inclusive policies and procedures. And so taking that additional moment to take a step back and recognize the way that we're coming at the work is really, really important. Okay, and so we get to this space, again, just really quickly, where we're aiming to acknowledge different worldviews. And with this, we're able to recognize different cultural attributes of individuals that we're working with or that we're serving. So we want to get to this place where we're acknowledging worldviews. And when we are at that space, we're able to promote this mutual understanding. This is everything that we're talking about in the realm of policies and procedures, right? We want to create mutual understanding about the ways in which our rules or our policies are impacting our practices, okay? We want to have that mutual understanding. We can co-create these cross-cultural understanding to resolve conflict, again, comes up when we're talking about policy, right? Co-create new stories, design new rituals, right? These practices, and then find those inclusive metaphors to contain their meaning. Again, unpacking that language, again, is saying, what is the meaning behind this attendance policy, right? What is the meaning behind this dress code policy, right? Whose cultural attributions were part of this narrative, okay? We see this, and again, I'm bringing up dress code and things like that because it's relatively streamlined across multiple spaces, and we can kind of reflect on that. But thinking about maybe in some school spaces where we have these ideas of appropriate dress or appropriate hair, right? We've seen different things within school spaces where if specifically children of color have dreadlocks or have specific hairstyles, right, they might not necessarily be allowed to participate in specific activities. Is there a policy in place that doesn't have this opportunity to acknowledge different worldviews, acknowledge different cultural perspectives? Okay, we want to be able to recognize those different barriers. And then, of course, when we're at that space, we acknowledge that if we aren't recognizing different perspectives and different experiences, there's this my way or the highway type of mentality. Okay, that's kind of what we're looking to avoid, but it just allows us to kind of look at this work through this cultural perspective. We also want to recognize, right, who in our organization, what's the mix up of our staff, right? So we can think of gender definition, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, individuals experiencing or living in poverty, individuals who identify as refugees, right? These are all of the things that we want to start thinking about for the folks who are internal to our space. And in a moment, I'll share some other cultural attributes that we can think of for the folks that we're providing services for? Stephanie.
Two things. One is a technical thing. I don't know if everybody's screen is doing the same thing, but for mine, I can only see part of your slide.
Okay.
Is
Is
it?
anybody else having that same issue? I can try to share and stop sharing.
It might have been something I did. Okay, everyone else can see the full screen. I hope I'm recording it well. I'll fiddle around with that. But my other thing I wanted to comment on is one theme that, you know, as over many, many months, multiple organizations have been taking a very deep dive into trauma-informed services, trauma-informed supervision, trauma-informed schools, and things like policy. A theme has been like connection and relationship as being like a foundation for like regulating our nervous systems and mitigating you know, a stress response and making good decisions in our prefrontal cortex instead of getting hijacked by the other parts of our brain. And so yeah, I just see this theme over and over of like sometimes our policies and our practices, just because of culture, like nobody's fault, like value compliance over connection. And it doesn't mean compliance and boundaries aren't important, but I think it's sometimes like just reflecting on that and just knowing that the trade-off for like the connection and the relationship may be more than the compliance itself. And again, not to be falling into a false binary that happens when we start talking about trauma-informed practice, that it means either like no compliance and everything goes and, you know, treat everyone with no accountability. That's not what we're talking about, you know, versus the other side of that spectrum, which would be like compliance above all. That we can do all this with boundaries and with accountability, and also be mindful of that connection and relationship where it makes sense. So I just wanted to name that a lot of this is about the safety that is found in connection. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for bringing that to the conversation, because that's huge. And I know that we've talked about that before, but recognizing that this is an and situation, right? It's not either or, it can be and because some of this is again newer to the ways in which we're practicing, it's going to feel a little bit awkward, right? Is it more compliance? Is it more connection, right? We're trying to find those ways that we have that connection, right? And we have these clear expectations, and we're recognizing individuals' boundaries, all of these different things. It's going to take practice. It's going to be a little bit clumsy, right? We're going to have to go back to the drawing board a couple of times because it's new, and it's going to just take this opportunity for us to be flexible with one another. And again, say, well, I only know what I know. Here's how I can bring some of the tools that I'm learning to hopefully enhance these opportunities for inclusion and belonging. So definitely. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Also, just similar to the slide that we just looked at, but this is just the opportunity to think about the cultural attributes of the communities that we're serving. So again, oftentimes when we're thinking about cultural attributes, maybe if you even thinking about the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we kind of get bogged down almost on these first couple bullets in our first box, right? You might think of race, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, and kind of get stuck within that perspective. These are all of the different things that we want to start thinking about when we're providing policies or developing policies, and also how we're providing information outwardly to the community, right? So thinking of things like literacy level, right? Who is the community that I'm serving? If I'm sharing promotional material, how am I going to make sure that this information is grasped by the individuals around us, right? So just different things for us to start thinking about as we're developing relationships, recognizing that connection aspect, but also recognizing how we can continue to empower community voice and choice as well, right? Jessica? No, okay, sorry.
Sorry, I just had somebody walk in and I was trying to just re-engage myself with
No, that's okay. You popped up on my screen, so I just wanted to check in. Any thoughts, questions about the couple slides that are up right now? All right, so we'll keep moving along here. Again, this is just kind of an opportunity for us to reflect on the reasons behind why we develop policies, practices, procedures. Again, just as Stephanie mentioned, there's these opportunities to recognize the expectations, the compliance, but also on the community relationship aspect as well, right? So when we're asking these questions, we're engaging in these conversations, it's important to recognize the choice to self-identify with certain concepts is a person's decision, right? So we want to make sure we're focusing on that person-centered language, right? Not necessarily a diagnosis or disability should never define a person. Again, bringing some of these notes from the practices of trauma-informed work that we're doing. We all have these different social contexts, personalities, goals, aspirations. It's important to give space and recognize that, and also bring that into the ways in which we start to promote our policies across spaces. And then, of course, that last bullet here, thinking about how we can make those modifications and adaptations to change our approaches, right? How we can communicate and how we can ensure successful outcomes, but also really emphasizing that safety, trust, transparency, and community within that. Okay, so just a couple things for us to think about. And then also recognizing that when we're working on our policies, developing them over time, our goal is to have this high level of belongingness and high level of uniqueness to get to that place of inclusion. Okay, so we're looking at inclusion here. Individuals are treated as an insider and they're encouraged to retain their uniqueness within a work group, right? We're encouraging folks to bring their uniqueness to the workspace because we know that that uniqueness is going to enhance all of the aspects of the work that we do. Right. And internally, I know, and I'm saying that I know because I feel like I've gotten the opportunity to work with so many of you in different ways. I know the intent is always to have that space of inclusion, right? And then sometimes as we are in this process, it quickly becomes assimilation and we don't even always recognize it. We'll get into this conversation about groupthink a little bit later and how these policies kind of are perpetuated without even acknowledging maybe some of those different cultural attributes that might be omitted from the conversation. Okay, so again, goal within our policies and our practices within our organizations is to have this high level of belongingness and these high levels of uniqueness to equate to the space of inclusion. Okay, so any thoughts or questions before we move on? How are we doing? I'm talking fast at you, so I just want to check in. I got some thumbs up. We're good? Okay. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about inclusive hiring practices. Again, given that today is just kind of a foundational introduction to these topics, I always find that starting here is really good in the sense that we're always looking to hire, recruit, and retain really wonderful dynamic employees within our spaces. And one opportunity is to explore how we're hiring folks around us. Okay, and so this here, of course, is just kind of, again, foundational just to get us all in the same space. Is any individual who's supporting the hiring of individuals, we want to make sure we're clearly defining the roles and responsibilities of the hiring team. Okay, this might go without saying, but I do feel it's important just to note, especially when we're thinking about policies and practices. Maybe the hiring, we have a policy surrounding hiring. Maybe there's something that we can add, like an amendment, thinking about the ways in which we approach hiring, right? Do we have a clear criteria? Are we including multiple people in those hiring opportunities to make sure it's not just senior leaders making the decision who's hired, but it's also those people that individual might be working with as well. So making sure that they're part of that conversation. Okay, we want to, of course, before we get into those spaces, review applicant materials before the interview, share responsibilities to make sure that we're approaching this in an unbiased and fair way. And then, of course, take clear job-related fact-based notes. And then from this will eliminate any confusion about what's expected. Okay, and so once we get to that space, we want to recognize bias, right? So if you were part of the conversation last year, hard to believe it was last year, we had a whole opportunity to really explore implicit bias. And so when we're thinking about hiring diverse members of our team, we want to recognize maybe different biases that we might not necessarily always be consciously aware of. Okay, maybe it's bias surrounding gender, right? Maybe there's this idea in our mind that this specific role has to be for someone who identifies as female, right? Whether that's right or wrong, maybe it's just a bias that we're holding. And so when we get a job application and the name appears to be something that is male sounding, right? Do I have a bias to say, oh, this person that might not be a good fit for the job, right? I want to be able to ask these questions of what am I thinking? Why am I thinking it? And is there a past experience that is impacting my current decision, right? And is the past experience applicable now, or is it based on preference or bias? Okay, so this is really, really important for us to start thinking about, and also finding the language to talk about it, right? If I am working with a team and I know we're hiring for a specific position, and I recognized, oh, Marie, you had some gender bias there. You just looked at this resume and you noticed that there was some bias. Maybe what I'm going to do is say, you know what, Stephanie, I just recognize that I just recognize that there is some bias. Do you mind sitting down with me and reviewing this resume with me so that we can take an unbiased approach to really looking at the skills and attributes that this person can bring, right? So that's an opportunity for me to be accountable, say, I'm still working on this, right? It's still there, it's still real. Let me bring a colleague here with me to support me, and we can have this unbiased opportunity, okay? So these are those questions that we can start asking ourselves when we're in this space of hiring. We can also be aware of triggers within ourselves and within others. Remember, we're likely to face people who are like us. And this is really, really interesting. There's a lot of research talking about preference bias specifically in workspaces. And what happens is, again, if we don't have this diverse team hiring folks, we start to hire people who are similar to us, right? Similar age, similar gender identity, similar background, similar politics, right? All of those things, which can be really, really great, right? And we don't even recognize we're consciously doing it, but we might be missing a whole opportunity of other candidates. Okay, so if I know I'm favoring this person, maybe because we went to the same post-secondary school, right? Maybe that's a bias, and I might need to bring in other perspectives to make sure that that's not impacting that final decision.
Can I
Okay.
say something about hiring?
Yes, please do.
So I just want to comment on hiring peers. So I've been in a lot of interviews, and we're not allowed to ask certain questions like, I'd like to be, have you ever been a junkie? You ever been in a mental hospital? And if they say no, I'll say too bad. People come into interviews and they want to put their best foot forward, and we're a little bit constrained, and we can't really ask. I want lived experience, and so that makes hiring a little tricky. You know, I just wanted to say that I think it's interesting to try to coax out of people what their lived experience is without violating some federal law.
Well, and that's really important. I see Terry also of thinking about how we can even promote that specific job. And I don't know necessarily the details of that, but is there language that we can include within that hiring, right? Preferred somebody with lived experience. And of course, there could be a different way to say that. Terry?
Yeah, you want to check with your lawyer, but it's my understanding that if your posting of the job has in it that a requirement of the job is that the person have a lived experience in recovery from mental health or substance use, that then allows you to ask that question. But check with your lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that's how you get around it.
Yeah, thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Terry.
Good opportunities to explore, especially in the work that we do, right? If having that lived experience really enhances those opportunities to create connection with the community, that might be a question that we really want to ask and or have really stated within those opportunities or the application specifically, right? And then the last thing here, just basing our decisions on facts rather than gut instinct. I personally am I'm so bad at this. I trust my gut. I'm like, my gut is telling me something's up, right? I have to tell my gut to just quiet it down for a minute. Let me find some facts. Oftentimes my gut is wrong, right? But being able to have those factual information to support that. And again, bringing in your colleagues and peers as we're going through this process. Okay, so this is just kind of a example that we have of opportunities when we're thinking about scoring criteria for job interviews or applicants specifically. We want to make sure that our criteria is unbiased, right? So some specific things we have are knowledge, right? Is there a specific certificate, degree, or license if required for that job. Again, thinking about the power of language, right? What does it mean to be quote unquote qualified for a specific position? Can we expand on what that means? Ability, right? Maybe it's years of experience, transferable experience. Maybe it's not specific experience in this role, but other experience, skills, job specific requirements. And then we'll go through in a moment that commitment to DEI as well. Any questions? I think, Stephanie, I thought I saw you on mute. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'll ask second if anybody wants to ask first. I've been asking a lot of questions.
Yeah, that's fine. Thoughts, questions, experiences?
I would, two things occur to me. One is it's unique about working in a rural close-knit community is that sometimes we even have biases associated with names, family names, whether they're positive or negative. So that's something to think about. Another is I was thinking about our policy at Brief. We are always looking for family member representatives and young adult member representatives with lived experience who can be a part of our coalition so that we can center their experience. And in the application form, like I started with one that was like a model from another county, but I noticed that it had like people had to really detail a lot about their lived experience. And I questioned if that was necessary. So what we've done is our application just has like, you know, have you had lived experience with any of these, you know, parts of the system? And then you just say yes or no. And it has a list like, you know, mental health services or DSS, or even, you know, applying for SNAP benefits, or, you know, a number of things where we're, you know, we want lived experience in our system. It could be a variety of things, but it is defined, and they just say yes or no. I have experience with these. And then I do like a private conversation with them, and I invite them to share about that if they want to, but they still don't have to, because unlike a peer advocate has a different job description, and it really is part of their job to like to tell their story. But I think in not every situation, you know what I mean? So I think we might have more flexibility in those areas than we realize. And I don't think I think it can be traumatizing to, you know, have to share those with strangers. Again, especially if it isn't absolutely required. So sorry, that's a way of saying that. So we do have that was a policy change we made technically on the application and sort of on the process for interviewing.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, and no apologies necessary. I appreciate too that opportunity that you all created within that policy to have options, right? Because as you mentioned, right, if I have to type up this whole thing about one specific experience when I've experienced 5, right? Maybe there's an opportunity to have that expansion with a person and have that support. So again, you're not saying, oh, you know, we're trauma informed, fill out all this thing detailing your trauma and just go sit by yourself after you detailed all your trauma, right? So again, being able to recognize that in a different way. So I think that's great. So thank you for sharing. So again, this is just a very, very quick, brief opportunity to look at an unbiased scoring guide. Of course, it can be more expansive. There can be more details specific to the job. But again, this is just kind of one thing that we can start to look at. And every individual within that hiring committee would fill out the same scoring rubric, and it would be totaled based on what you're seeing here. So again, opportunities to recognize bias, but hopefully eliminate that bias when it comes down to that formal decision. Okay, and so we see here at the bottom a commitment to DEI. And so something that we're seeing across organizations as we're really aiming to encourage this commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or opportunities for applicants or interviewees to share their experience surrounding DEI. Again, this can be something that when we're looking at the scoring, if this person doesn't have any experience, right, if we're totaling the score, that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't necessarily a good fit for this job, right? So it's again taking into account all of this together for that summation of the score. So some questions and opportunities. This can be done in an interview. This can be done over a phone interview. This can be done even just on the application in of itself. Some questions that we just kind of pulled together are, in your opinion, what's the best way to ensure that diversity is viewed as a strength, right? This could be an interview question where we give that opportunity for folks to expand on their experience and why diversity is viewed as a strength. How would you incorporate equity and inclusion into your work, or how have you incorporated equity and inclusion in your work? Again, giving folks that opportunity to reflect, but also giving that opportunity for the interviewee or interviewers to acknowledge that our organization is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So just an opportunity to kind of model that. How have you worked with others to foster the creation of climates receptive to equity and inclusion? And then in what ways have you integrated multicultural issues as part of your professional development? Okay, so these are just kind of opportunities for us to think about how we can ask about an individual's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is also opportunities for us to get flexible and dynamic, right? Even the ways in which we define diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is there only a focus on race or ethnicity, or is there a focus on multiple spheres of equity and inclusion and other intersecting identities? Okay, so just some opportunities for us to start thinking about how we can have these discussions related to equity and inclusion. And then also recognizing how comfortable folks are answering these questions, right? If we notice that the candidate might not necessarily be using a gender neutral language, if somebody in the room identifies as non-binary, or just in general, right? Do they address all members of the candidate pool altogether? Okay, all of those things are important for us to kind of recognize within this space. And then, of course, we talked about this a little bit as well when Jessica brought up her experience with hiring and retaining employees. It's important for us to, of course, invest in onboarding opportunities. And so again, sometimes we might not necessarily pay so much attention to this space, but it really is important for us to recognize this is an opportunity to emphasize our commitment to equity, inclusion, and trauma-informed practices. We can introduce the JEDI team or other employee resource groups here. And I use JEDI as kind of a general term of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. It can be DEIB work groups. It can be really any work group, but this is an opportunity to, again, show the commitment to folks coming onto our team. And then, of course, again, having those opportunities to model behaviors. Talk about the trainings that the team has engaged in, talk about trainings that will be coming down the line. All of those types of things are really, really important for us as we're bringing on new team members. Okay, breathe for a second. We've got 30 minutes left. How are we doing? We're doing okay? Okay, we are going to be on our last section, and then I promise I'll get you out of here, hopefully on time. We're going to move into the space of thinking about regional considerations. Okay, so our first question, it says in the chat, but please feel free to unmute yourself. Are there any regional considerations that should be recognized as we develop equity-focused trauma-informed policies and practices? If so, what are those considerations? What are our thoughts?
Well, I think one thing is that we don't see a lot of diversity in our candidates that are, especially in applying for jobs and positions. That's difficult, rarely do we interview someone who's not a white woman at our clinic. So that's a challenge. And we are always looking to try to expand and include other populations. And then additionally, in our client population, we tend to see more diversity with gender identity and, with neurodiversity, and sometimes with, other, any disabilities that might come, developmental disabilities or disabilities of various kinds. But we're not seeing a lot of race and ethnicity diversity. So some important things to think about in terms of training, wanting to stay current in all practices, but also trying to spend our training resources on and time on the diversity issues that we're seeing more regularly.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm seeing in the chat some folks just agreeing with that sentiment and your experience, right? It's important for us to also recognize the demographic around us, right? As we're talking about community voice and choice, we want to recognize what that community looks like, it engages with, all of those types of things. And so as we're bringing some folks into our team who, you know, might have different levels of diversity, maybe we're thinking about gender identity, age, ability, all of those types of things, right? How are we again making sure that those experiences are really rooted within our policies and our procedures, and including those opportunities for education, right, for other communities that might not necessarily be in our geographic location, right? So it's this balance, but making sure that the folks that we're bringing on also have that commitment as well, right? Anything else? Any other considerations?
I don't know if this would really qualify as a regional consideration, but I think one of the things that that maybe me as an old person sort of struggles with is adjusting kind of expectations or ideas about what it means to be an employee on a younger population that has differing opinions about you know, what it means to be employed. And especially in a governmental environment, it becomes even increasingly more difficult. So I don't know how to kind of negotiate that, and how to set appropriate expectations in the job interview. You know, I guess there was an assumption on my behalf that people would show up to work on time. Like, that's not something I have to say in an interview, but it seems like something that that we struggle with employees these days.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Terry, for sharing. And right, I definitely recognize that as, yes, the regional issue, right, that you're experiencing, but also it goes across in other spaces as well when we're thinking about, you know, just generational differences, right? If we're thinking about, you know, I think it was great when we talked about, and I'm going to kind of summarize a little bit, but thinking about ideas surrounding work ethic, right? These assumptions or ideas that might not necessarily be clear cut for other generations, right? For whatever reasons that we can start to think about, how do we have those opportunities to kind of meet in that middle and discuss expectations, right? Discuss expectations that are kind of non-negotiable for the job, right? For the example that you gave, right? Showing up to work on time, right? How can we make sure that that's clear within our policies, within our practices, et cetera, and also give those opportunities to share other perspectives from other generational experiences as well. So it's this interesting dynamic that I think we are in right now. And it's hard to have those hard conversations sometimes, especially when we're at this space of, I thought everyone knew this, right? And having those folks come in with different perspectives or different lived experiences. But definitely, right? That can definitely be something that's regional. So thank you so much. And I also see in the chat mention of income disparities. Definitely. Yeah, that's definitely something that is important for us to take into consideration as we're developing policies and practices, and also just thinking about the community that we're serving, and also those employees, right, who might experience different income disparities, right? Making sure we're thinking about that when we're thinking about policies and procedures. I know that some policies are written for folks that have to bring their own devices to the workspace, right? Are we thinking about maybe those income barriers for some folks if that's not something that's realistic for them, right? So again, just thinking those things through a little bit as well. And then some other things that I just wanted to reference as well is, we already mentioned paying attention to the demographics over time. We want to recognize that David just mentioned, right, the communities are around you all, also the generational changes, age, ability, all of those types of things. Focus on rural populations. We want to make sure that we're recognizing that it's very unique. Okay, oftentimes we have these ideas that we want to compare to other spaces, but if the spaces have different demographics and different experiences, those results just might look different overall. Okay. We want to make sure we're adopting a regional approach when using demographic data. And I know this is something that you all have been doing for a very long time. And I know that Stephanie and I are also working on opportunities to do some evaluation and metrics surrounding this too. So some things that I already know are in the works, but then of course recognize that power and privilege often surpass population numbers in rural areas. And so this is something that I just kind of want to emphasize, and we'll look in our next slide at our conversation of our power and privilege wheel, right? As we think about the communities that we're serving, maybe there's this idea that we have a lot of homogenous identities. Maybe we're thinking about gender identities. Maybe we have this assumption that everyone within our community identifies as a white cisgendered male or female, right? Maybe that's this general idea that we have. And so that idea, right, or that experience might omit the experiences of folks who might not fit into that specific space. Okay, so those dominant beliefs, ideas, experiences might have that defining power to make that final decision without necessarily recognizing those other folks that aren't part of that conversation. Okay, so thinking about how power and privilege come into play, and of course recognizing that power and privilege are of course contextual and they shift over time. Okay, so just some things for us to think about. This is our power and privilege wheel here. This is one of my favorite little images that I like to kind of pull from and just relate to when we're thinking about power and privilege, especially if we're thinking about different regional and demographic findings. When we're looking at our power wheel, the closer you are to the center of the wheel in our society, the more power you have. The further out on the wheel, the less power you have. Okay, so let's say we identify as white, we are able-bodied, and we identify as heterosexual. Okay, so those three identities are really close to our power wheel, right? Doesn't mean that you always have loads of power in all situations. It's contextual, but within our society, you might have more power, right? If I changed one of these things and said, let's say that you are non-English speaking, right? Maybe you learned English later in life, you still identify as able-bodied and you still identify as heterosexual, right? The language brings you out to the outer of the wheel, right? So there's some identities that allow you to have more power and some identities that you have less power, okay? That's gonna shift across different spaces and different times. And so we just wanna recognize if we do have more power in spaces, how are we utilizing that power, right? Are we providing opportunities to empower those with different levels of power, right? Are we making sure we're including those folks with different levels of power in the conversation as well? Okay, so again, going back to thinking about restoring community voice and choice, these are opportunities to kind of reflect on how power and privilege comes to play. Okay, again, really recognizing when we talk about power, that power is relational. Okay, and in different relationships, they can either reinforce or disrupt one another. So it becomes this practice to say, oh, I do have a little bit more power in this space, right? What can I do with my power in this moment, maybe for folks who might have different levels of power, okay? And also, being cognizant of even the language that I'm using, right? Restoring voice and choice, restoring power. It's even opportunities to let folks know, hey, by the way, you do have power in this space, right? Because if folks are a part of historically marginalized communities, they might not always feel like they have power, but even that reminder of, by the way, right, we do want you to speak. We do want to hear your experience and your voice within this space. Okay, so just looking at the power wheel as a resource, especially as when we're developing different policies and procedures. Okay, thinking really quickly as we wrap up our conversation, we're going to have some opportunities just to think about what we're doing within our communities as well as thinking about when we're investing in our community, we want to make sure that we find that desired impact by measuring the effectiveness over time. Okay, so I've said it multiple times today, but recognizing community voice and power and being able to measure that, right? being able to say, oh, you know, this community has asked for these things to feel more empowered, to feel more valued, to feel like they belong, right? This is what our objectives were in 2024. Here's what it looks like in 2025. Being able to measure that over time is really, really, really powerful. We want to make sure that, of course, that we're designing and developing programs that are equitable, and then thinking about resources for productive action. Again, as we work in spaces where we have a plethora of different resources, which is phenomenal to have, we want to make sure that the resources that we're providing actually make sense for the individual, right? If the resource involves 3 modes of transportation and taking a train somewhere, right? That might not necessarily be an effective resource for this specific individual, right? Maybe there's a more local resource this individual can have access to. Different things like that when we're thinking about resources and productive action. And then just recognizing, as we talk about trauma-informed care, we also want to recognize this relationship with the practices that we've talked about, but this idea surrounding resiliency, or the opportunity and the capacity to experience resiliency. Again, as we're creating policies and procedures, we're recognizing how we can design practices that make folks feel safe, feel like they belong, and they're empowered, right? As we know, through trauma and we're navigating our life every day, we need these opportunities that we see here in this space to help us have those opportunities to experience resiliency, whether that's as self or as the community overall. Okay, so we're going to pause here, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm hoping that we can just have some opportunities to chat about what our experience has been like in our respective workspaces, developing policies and practices surrounding trauma-informed, equity-focused work. So I'm going to pause. Any questions first and foremost? Any questions, thoughts? Checking in.
I'll just say, I think it's significant that DEI policy is trauma-informed policy. And so a lot of what we try to do is connect the dots, or, you know, maybe it's not everything is going to be called a trauma-informed policy. And also a lot of our organizations or funders have have guidance or laws even, in our state that do affect workforces in schools, for example. Like there are policies. So anyway, just, broadening our minds could mean a lot of different things.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. And I think that's a good point. I think sometimes when we approach policy, right, it's very nuanced. It can be very complicated, and we recognize that there's different governing bodies that might impact some of our policies and procedures. And so we want to recognize the areas that we can control, but also recognize that there's also opportunities for us to connect with those lawmakers or those who are establishing these laws and policies to recognize, oh, this might not necessarily be the most effective thing anymore. How can we move to this space of inclusion? And of course, trauma-informed practices, which again, as Stephanie mentioned, right, they go hand in hand, right? This is kind of why we're doing this work in this approach, because it doesn't necessarily always make sense to talk about them separately. Yes, we can, but in this essence, how can we create our policies to be trauma-informed and equitable simultaneously, right? Any other thoughts, any questions? Okay, so I'm just going to quickly share my screen one more time just to show our calendar here for what's coming up next. We do have our coaching call coming up on January 25th. And so myself and John Pavlik will be there to engage in some more open conversations. And so on this day, it's an opportunity for us to, of course, talk and expand on some of the things that we talked about today. But this is also an opportunity for us to kind of sit down and have open conversations, right? This is what we've been able to implement in our organization. This has been really effective. Maybe there's a barrier that we want to talk about and expand a little bit more. That's kind of this space to have these conversations. And then coming down the pipeline in February, which feels like it's like around the corner, which is hard to believe. We'll have an opportunity to engage in a conversation surrounding LGBTQ plus communities, and this will be an actual in-person event, so really excited for that as well. And then I know Stephanie will continue to communicate other opportunities as they come. Okay, so
yeah, I just wanted to note there's some, so this calendar is, these are like specifically things that we have intentionally been building over the months with CCSI as kind of like a anchor and a facilitator for what's become a learning community for leaders and increasingly others in agencies across our system of care. So, but then we have additional things, like we have a couple like trauma-informed foundations trainings coming up. We have resiliency coaching with Nan Henderson. Jessica and Thompson and I have just developed a training that's specifically about like how resiliency and our Essex County system of care are interdependent. So I'm going to put a link to our training series there, and they'll be continually announced. But the ones that that Marie just mentioned are especially important if you are like a member of a trauma-informed team at your organization. Maybe you want to be, maybe you want to join the trauma-informed team. Maybe it hasn't necessarily been widely announced yet. So that's something to think about as well. And we've been trying to check in almost like quarterly about things like, oh, how is your trauma-informed policy going? Or how is your trauma-informed reflective supervision going? And what we find, and you know, folks like Dava and Terry and Tracy Surlock and Doug Meyer and others have been on what they have, what we've observed, and what's like Doug Myers says it really well, is that because these agencies are doing this work together in a spirit of goodwill, it actually builds a lot of trust. And we realize none of this is easy, right? So the point isn't to judge each other of like, you're not being trauma informed enough, but to share things like Jessica Darney-Buehler and Dava started to talk about like, well, how do you do that form? How do you do that? You know, what is your policy on that? So to really like share best practice, because like it's cheesy, but we are all in this together, right? So I just wanted to note that that's like sort of a distinguishing thing about what Marie just showed you in our larger thing. And then also there are opportunities probably within your organizations to join a leadership team around this, or an advisory group that should really be representative of different parts of the organization. So you're not in this alone, that's what I'm trying to say.
Well, no, thank you so much, Stephanie. And really, as I mentioned as well during our coaching calls, it really is an opportunity to continue to share those resources and best practices and have just kind of a more kind of one-on-one, two-on-one type of conversation with folks. And if we've got lots of folks, we can do some breakout rooms. If it's just a few folks, we're really flexible with the approach of it. We just want to make sure that it's something beneficial for you all. And along the way, I know that we'll send some evaluations also just to kind of gain some feedback from you all to gauge what's been effective within some of these trainings and conversations, but also what you want to see more of. Okay, so that's all I have for you. I want to say that I've never ended early for training because I'm a talker. So this is great. You got about 10 minutes back in your day, but thank you so much for sharing your morning and into the afternoon with me today. If any questions come up, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'm looking forward to continuing our work together, and I really, really appreciate you all for sharing today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you, everyone. So nice to see familiar and new faces. We'll be in touch.
Yes, have a good one.
Thank you, Marie.
Thank you.